Good morning, everyone, and can I welcome you to this, the second meeting of the Public Audit Committee of 2026. We have received apologies this morning from our convener, Richard Leonard, and I shall be deputising in his absence. Agenda item 1 is to decide whether we will take agenda items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the Auditor General for Scotland's Section 22 report into the 2024-25 audit of Historic Environment Scotland. Can I first of all welcome our witnesses this morning, Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General for Scotland, Lisa Duffy, the Audit Director, and Carol Grant, also Audit Director at Audit Scotland. Now, before members get into our line of questionings, may I first of all invite the Auditor General to make a short opening statement on his report.
Many thanks indeed, Convener, and good morning to the committee. Convener, I'm presenting this report on the 24-25 audit of Historic Environment Scotland under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. This report brings to the committee's attention what we regard as unacceptable governance at Historic Environment Scotland, including weaknesses in procurement, personal data breaches and unclear processes for the distribution and use of complimentary tickets to events at its venues. Historic Environment Scotland has over 400 electronic purchasing cards, which incurred £1.9 million of expenditure in 2024-25. Despite this, the policy has not been updated since 2019, and audit testing identified a lack of compliance with the policy, including cases where expenditure above the £1,000 threshold was incurred without the required 3 quotes to provide assurance for value for money. The auditor also reported that almost half of the foreign travel cases reviewed had not been appropriately authorised, or the expenditure incurred exceeded the originally authorised amount. We also report on the Archive House project, and we again take a view that it wasn't acceptable that the project continues to incur expenditure despite being cancelled in 2024, and the decision to end this key project was not supported by either appropriate governance or scrutiny. I note that Historic Environment Scotland is currently navigating a period of significant instability and challenge. During 2025, it operated without a chief executive or accountable officer for almost 6 months of the year. While I recognise the complexity of this situation, I do believe that the Scottish Government should have appointed an accountable officer, a substitute accountable officer, to provide the necessary leadership and accountability. I further note that a new chair was appointed in September, together with an interim chief operating officer who was also recently appointed. It's clear that it's critical that strong controls are put in place to prevent the risk of fraud and demonstrate that value for money for this organisation is being achieved. The external auditor will of course monitor developments, including the implementation of their audit recommendations, and as ever I'll take a view about the necessary further public reporting following the conclusion of that work. And as we'll look to do, Convener, both Carol, Lisa and myself will do our utmost to answer the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Many thanks, Auditor General. We do have quite a wide range of questions, so we will get straight into them. But I'll maybe kick off abusing my new position of power, perhaps, to go first. But I'm quite intrigued by your opening comments. I think you used a number of phrases of terminology that, unfortunately, we've heard before in this committee from Section 22 reports around governance, instability, and unacceptable levels of governance within a public body. In your understanding, what do you believe has been the root cause of this period of instability at Historic Environment Scotland? How did they get to the situation that they got themselves into at the time of your audit?
So I'll turn to Lisa, as I suspect I will do a number of times today, as the appointed external auditor, upon whose work through the annual audit, I draw my conclusions in the Section 22 report. Lisa can give her own view, but I think what's maybe helpful to reference to the committee is the appendix that we set out to the Section 22 report that sets out something of the timeline of some of the changes in both the board and the senior leadership of the organisation, which references some of the instability, the volume of turnover. And I can't escape, Convener, the absence of a chief executive or accountable officer for a prolonged period during 2025. The organisation has reported towards the end of the year that the chief executive had returned from a period of leave to resume responsibilities for the accountable officer aspect of the annual report and accounts. But of course, the role of the senior leader is broader than just the annual report and accounts. It encompasses leadership and personal responsibility for the value for money for many of the transactions of the organisation. So that's such an important factor that there was an absence of leadership in the organisation. We also make reference in the report, and I'll turn to Lisa in a moment for her perspective, to some of the concerns about the culture of the organisation. The public response, which I welcome from the chair of Historic Environment Scotland to the Section 22 report, made an important contribution that the organisation would be initiating a review of its culture and effectiveness, with an intention that that will report, we understand, in May of this year. The committee will be cited that there has been much in the way of public commentary, media reporting, and indeed contributions from members of staff of the organisation about their concerns about some of the practices, the governance, the leadership. It's essential that all of these concerns are fully investigated, reviewed, so that the organisation can understand what it's dealing with, that it can, as all public bodies need to do, deliver what they are there to do, to ensure value for money and be effective users of public funds. So I think there's a range of strands, Convener, actually, but as I say, I think it'd be important for the committee to hear directly from Lisa from her audit work, so I'll bring her in at this point.
Thank you, Auditor General. So, as the Auditor General has said, we saw a significant amount of change and instability in the organisation throughout 24-25, including interim appointments at both the Director of Finance level, Chief Executive level, and then following that, the appointment of a permanent Chief Executive. So we think in part that that may have contributed to what we're seeing and what we've reported today. I think it's important to point out that some of the risks that we've followed up through the audit process were emerging at the beginning of the year and actually may have been seen in the previous audit appointment as well. And that includes the risk around the volume of electronic purchasing cards that Historic Environment Scotland has. So that was brought to my attention as part of the audit planning process. I also comment in my own annual audit report about on board effectiveness and the absence of a self-assessment in the year in which we're auditing as well. And that's one of the recommendations in my report that's carried out in the next year. We also know at the time of auditing that Archive House was a known risk. So that was already a known risk to the organisation. And that's reflected in Internal Audit's limited assurance opinion, where they talk about the disappointing implementation of management actions, and that partly is in reference to a review that took place on that project.
Thank you very much for that further update. And many of those areas that you've identified in your report, members do have questions on, so we will come back to you on those. If I could go back, perhaps, Auditor General, to just your summation of how they got themselves into this mess in the first place. Would it be your understanding that this is perhaps twofold in nature? One is internal problems with staff turnover and leadership at the very top of the organisation, but in parallel, a lack of oversight from the Scottish Government, this being, of course, a public body. And just to put it into context, Historic Environment Scotland employs over 1,600 members of permanent staff and has a turnover just in 1 year of over 140 million, is also in receipt of significant amounts of public money in terms of grant funding as well, around 70 million in the year that the auditors identified. So the importance of the role of the body itself what it actually does on a day-to-day basis surely has been somewhat compromised by this instability and lack of leadership, and perhaps has given way to some issues around public trust in the agency and the body and those that it assists on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's a number of strands to your points, Convener. No organisation will embrace or want to be subject to a Section 22 report. I absolutely recognise that. We think very carefully about the publication of such a report, but felt that there were matters of public interest significance that warranted reporting to Parliament on the conclusions that the Auditor reached in 24-25. I'll maybe turn to Carol in a moment, actually, just to address the sponsorship point that you're making about what role the Scottish Government has played. But I think what I would refer back to, I think it is a welcome development that the Chair of the Board has identified the need for some consideration of its culture and effectiveness. It will be really important that that's a full, proper exercise that explores some of the issues that are identified and remain unresolved in terms of staffing concerns, the position of the executive team, together with its policy and use of public funds. It is also an organisation, as you mentioned, its kind of financial structure, that while the ratio is broadly about half and half, but Lisa can correct me on that in terms of its receipt of public funding. But the other half is when it's a very significant revenue-generating organisation. And that's perhaps not surprising given the nature of its facilities and how attractive they are and use of events and conferences. It's also very clear, I think, an important point, its framework document that was agreed towards the end of 2024 places a significant emphasis upon its role in generating other income, with a clear mandate almost for Historic Environment Scotland to bring additional revenue, quite rightly exploiting its attractive resources to do so. So these may be additional factors as to how the organisation got into the circumstances that it finds itself. So there are both internal factors about some of the instability in terms of leadership and governance, but also the role that the Scottish Government played. I've already mentioned the fact that I don't think it was the right decision not to bring in an interim accountable officer, given the vital role set out in the public finance manual for an accountable officer. But I'll perhaps turn to Carol, actually, just to if it's helpful, to say a wee bit more about how that works and how these events unfolded from the government side.
And in your comments, Carol, it would be very helpful if you could elicit to us what conversations you had with the Scottish Government, including any of the directorates or sponsorship team members that you had conversations with in advance of the production of the Section 22 report, just so we get a feel for what the government's response was to the questions you put to them.
Thank you. So yes, picking up on what the Auditor General has said and the further questions from yourself. So I had direct engagement with the sponsor team involved with Historic Environment Scotland. I had two separate meetings to explore what was happening. My understanding from that conversation, or for those conversations, was that there was regular engagement. As you'll know, in terms of sponsorship, there is the ongoing relationship and engagement that takes place. But then within the Scottish Government, there are quarterly reviews. So that kind of taking a step back and assessing the relationship. So at the previous session, just before Christmas, we talked a little bit about the sponsorship approach. So just in terms of the timeline for Historic Environment Scotland, I can confirm that in the May assessment, they were moved from being a green rating to an amber rating in terms of the way the RAG status works and the assessment of the sponsorship arrangements and how the body is operating. And that moved to red later in the summer, in August that year, because of the issues that were emerging. From an audit perspective, so I had the specific meetings with the sponsor team, but I have the regular engagement through the DG assurance process, attending the meetings and engaging with those meetings as well, and providing evidence, having discussions about some of the issues that are being raised. So yeah, I've spoke to both the specific directors and the Director Generals involved.
Who was the lead sponsor, who was the lead Scottish Government sponsor that would be directly responsible for taking the decision to move someone from red to amber to green? And who in your understanding, provided the oversight of the sponsorship arrangements for that body?
So I might get the job title wrong. So my understanding is that it was the director, Kenneth Hogg, who was providing the oversight in terms of the sponsorship arrangements, and he works across the culture space for the Scottish Government. The assessment for the quarterly kind of reviews of sponsorship arrangements, it's initiated by the Central Public Body Sponsorship Unit and goes out to the sponsorship teams for completion. Then the process works that it comes in and it's almost kind of considered in the round, and that is what should be fed up through the DG assurance process to get that sense of the landscape, the risks that sit within it, and that enables the Director General to ask further questions and maybe get a little bit of review across to see where there's opportunities for wider learning or kind of support that could be provided where particular issues are being identified.
May I ask, and you may not know the answer to this, but are Audit Scotland aware of other public bodies that are currently in amber or red on that RAG status in terms of their sponsorship?
So that there are other bodies as part of the sponsors, the RAG status. It considers elements culture, governance, but also finance. And what we see when we look at the assessments fairly regularly is that the financial position drives some of the consideration round about the assessment. What we have suggested is that there is more of a focus beyond that. So where there is known financial pressures, the need to deliver efficiencies and savings, that should be considered, absolutely. But getting into the governance and the culture, staff survey results, all of those elements form part of the questions that are asked, and there is the opportunity for more focus on that as part of the assessment.
Well, Ms Grant, in your professional opinion, would you view that the move from green to amber to red was a result of a lack of action or response to issues that had been flagged by the sponsorship division, or was it perhaps issues within the sponsorship division itself in terms of the way that they were overseeing or governing, if you like, the body? So, or does perhaps the blame lie in both lobbies there?
It would probably be difficult for me to give a clear assessment of that. It may be something that would be better explored with the Scottish Government. What I would say is one of the proposals that we are suggesting is, as part of the assessment, getting more into positive assurance statements, because at the moment there's a lot of questions that are asked and answered in that, but the actual impact isn't necessarily always identified and fed through. And there is something about, thinking through the statement of, I am reassured that there are no issues within this body, might increase the emphasis and the focus for people in terms of completing that.
Very helpful. Auditor General, just before I pass on to other colleagues, the issue around the accountable officer seems to be quite a key one here. And I guess what we do want to get our head around is why, essentially, why there was no accountable officer, even on an interim or substitute basis, either appointed or internally chosen. At the time of the external audit that your report is based on, who was the actual principal accountable officer at the time of the audit? And was any explanation given to Audit Scotland, either by HES or the Scottish Government, as to why there was no accountable officer for 6 months? What was the formal explanation?
So I think what we set out, I think, hopefully in the Section 22 report, is a fluid set of circumstances that, if I refer back to the appendix to the Section 22 report, the first absence of the Chief Executive in May of 2025, and there are, what was referenced in the report, that there are interim arrangements within the executive leadership team. So duty director, I think, is the arrangements that the executive leadership team agreed with the former chair of the board to provide leadership within the organisation. And that period, we understand, and I'll bring Lisa in if there's anything that she wants to add to this, is that when somebody goes off sick, you're never necessarily sure how long they're going to be off. So recognise that that for the early period they might have felt able to deal with the circumstances. But there is guidance in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. I think it's after a period of a month or so, and again, happily clarify that. If the absence of the accountable officer is going to go on for a period longer than that, that then brings into play the likely or appropriate prospect of a substitute or interim accountable officer. Clearly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there was a period of almost 6 months that went on without such an arrangement. When the accountable officer did return to work towards the end of 2025, it was in a limited capacity, convener. It was only to finalise the annual report and accounts of Historic Environment Scotland. And that's, I wouldn't diminish that. It's an important part of the accountable officer's responsibilities. So, there are dedicated pages within the accounts for the accountable officer, asserts that they've done their job properly, that they're content with the transactions and so forth. But clearly it's not all of it. The day-to-day running of the organisation, both in a chief executive context, but also the prescribed key duties, again, set out in the SPFM for the accountable officer. So it is the responsibility of the permanent secretary as the principal accountable officer of the Scottish administration to appoint the accountable officers of public bodies, guided by advice, I'm sure, from the sponsorship team, contributions from the governance of public bodies. But I think what we've seen is really a lack of clarity as to why the Scottish Government chose not to, notwithstanding the fact that there was uncertainty or fluid environment in terms of how long the post holder would be absent. It's my view that a clearer intervention ought to have happened at a far earlier date. And even the circumstances today, that while the accountable officer is back at work, they're not yet fully exercising all of the responsibilities of the chief executive or accountable officer.
And those are questions which we rightly may wish to ask of the Scottish Government in response to your comments today. I'm going to bring a colleague in a sec, but can I ask if Audit Scotland had any conversations with any members or chair of the board of the agency, because presumably the role of the board is to provide some oversight as to the governance arrangements. It sounds to me like there was a distinct lack of.
I'll bring Lisa in, actually, who's, as you would expect, as her role as appointed officer, she has regular engagement with both the executive and non-executive. So I'll turn to Lisa and set some of that detail out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as we say at paragraph 8 of our report, we are aware that Historic Environment Scotland had ongoing discussions with the Scottish Government and that various options were explored at the time. I'll point you to a particular email that I received following a request for an update on the position of the accountable officer from the former chair of the board. So that clarifies that options were considered from the 4-week period when Historic Environment Scotland became aware that the accountable officer wouldn't be returning to work. So we know that under normal circumstances, it is likely that a member of the executive leadership team would have stepped up into that role, but given ongoing matters, that wasn't a possibility at the time. Other options explored that we're aware of was the appointment of an existing board member, the appointment of an ex-board member, and also several appointments that the Scottish Government put forward. What we don't have a definitive answer for you today on is why an option wasn't agreed upon at that moment in time. We do believe that might have been partly due to the fact that the accountable officer did intend to return to work, and we believe that may have been a barrier.
Thank you for that further information. Mr Simpson has a supplementary question on this theme.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick follow-up. Auditor General, this report came out just last month, and at that point there wasn't a permanent Director of Finance and Corporate Services. Do you know if there is one now?
So I'll turn to Lisa, I think, for the detail and the position on that, Mr Simpson.
So there's not. That post is still an interim appointment.
Okay, and how long is the interim period for? Do we know?
So we don't know the answer to that at the moment, although recent conversations with the Chief Executive and the new Chair of the Board, I know that that's a priority for them.
Okay.
I'm going to pass the line of questions over to Mr. Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. General, I'd like to just chew over a bit about procurement again. Paragraph 15 of your report states that there were weaknesses in the current risk governance and control procedures that would affect the delivery of objectives, and weaknesses particularly in procurement relating to the inappropriate use of single source justification. Now, internal audit raised this as part of your report. Did they raise it with the management, the board? And if so, when?
They did. So we'll Lisa can perhaps talk the committee through some of the specifics of that point about the work of internal audit. I think she alluded to earlier that internal audit were also raising concerns about some of the procurement practices within the organisation, and importantly, their overall conclusion on the effectiveness of the internal control environment was one of a limited assurance. So that's significant. It reflects that, that they have considered the overall activity, and that would be strongly influenced by their judgments on the single source, which again Lisa can say a bit more about. But I think as we go on to say supplementing the work of internal audit from our own testing, just the overall arrangements around the use of electronic procurement cards, the volume of members of staff in the organisation, over 400 of these cards in place, as the convener mentions, a staffing quota of about 1,700. So there are concerns about how all of these practices were operating that I think, as I mentioned when discussed some of this with the committee at your earlier session on the Scottish Government, increased the risk and around the effective use of public money and the risk of fraud that the organisation was dealing with. But again, I'll bring Lisa to say more about the work of internal audit first of all.
Thank you, Auditor General. So there's two separate points within paragraph 15. The first of those to touch upon is the limited assurance opinion from internal audit. And the reasons for that are set out in Historic Environment Scotland's governance statement, as you would expect. But the basis of that opinion is around the significant change in the leadership within Historic Environment Scotland, which we've also reported on. The implementation of management actions resulting from recommendations considered to be disappointing by the Internal Audit Service, and outstanding recommendations related to the limited assurance opinion review of the Archive House project. The second point relates to an issue that was brought to my attention in July, and that was also shared with Historic Environment Scotland, and that was through whistleblowing. That was subsequently investigated by the Internal Audit Department and the Chair of the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee within Historic Environment Scotland. And from an audit perspective, I was looking for assurance that that had been carried out appropriately. The conclusion there, as set out in our report, is that there was an inappropriate use of single source justification, and that was to backfill a vacant post. Internal Audit have subsequently indicated that a review of single source justification will be carried out, and it's been identified as an area of risk within the organisation.
Can you maybe comment on whether there's any correlation between the absence of the accountable officer and the introduction of these practices, or do they predate that? Is it something that sort of grew up over a period?
So the particular point that we mention in our report predates the absence of the accountable officer.
Okay.
I would just add, Mr. Beattie, I think it's the case that many of the issues that we are reporting on are actually events that are taking place in what's the current financial year of 2025-26, but straddle the period from the end of the 2024-25 financial year to the end of March through to the audit reporting period when the audit concluded at the end of December. So we do cite, and Lisa mentions in her audit report, that the audit was delayed. So it didn't conclude in the anticipated timescale because of the absence of an accountable officer. In some ways, that delay allowed us to explore in more depth and the circumstances that we set out in both the annual audit report and the Section 22 report. But I think so I think it's a combination. So some of the circumstances about the volume of procurement cards will predate the absence of the accountable officer. But again, if I refer back to the appendix to the Section 22 report, many of the events are relatively live and recent, having taken place during 2025 or the tail end of 24.
Now, in relation to procurement, you've mentioned one or two of the weaknesses that were found. Were there any others that were identified?
Well, again, I'll turn to Lisa can come into a bit of detail, but I might reference some of the conclusions that were made in the annual audit report on the back of the detailed audit testing that was undertaken on procurement cards and transactions, including instances where staff did not obtain and then retain quotes for items of expenditure over £1,000 in line with the procurement card policy so that they can demonstrate value for money. Lack of evidence to support approval of staff purchasing items above a transaction limit of £1,200. Lack of challenge by procurement for requests to improve an increase in either a transaction or a card limit. And invoices not always including sufficient detail of purchases. These are all matters of concern, and Lisa goes on to give some examples of specifics in terms of purchase of accommodation and a replacement kitchen. But there are some cultural matters for the organisation to tackle in its use of procurement cards. It should rightly consider whether it needs to have as many of those. The volume of transactions that are going through procurement cards of £1.9 million in 2024-25. 8% of the checks, the compliance checks, carried out. But it's whether or not important, is that sufficient volume to give assurance to the organisation? I'll turn to Lisa, Mr. Beattie, but I think what we're clear is there are a range of issues within the organisation's arrangements and its use of procurement cards that it should take a step back to take a clear view whether these are appropriate and necessary and give them the appropriate range of robust internal controls on their use of public money.
These items have been getting raised with the board. What did the board do about it?
So again, Lisa can say more, but I think that's an important part of the response from the chair of the board, the new chair of the board, to review their culture and effectiveness. It would be appropriate as part of that review to take a step back and satisfy themselves that their procurement arrangements for use of public money are appropriate, robust and necessary for this organisation. But in terms of the direct interaction, I'll bring Lisa and can say more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Auditor General. So just in terms of the role of the board, so the risk of fraud and based on the volume and other factors associated with the electronic procurement cards was raised. It was discussed at the Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee, and Internal Audit subsequently carried out a review of electronic purchasing cards, and I reflect on that in my report and the recommendations there. So there was a response. We've also more recently seen a response to wider procurement weaknesses with a lowering or a planned lowering of the procurement threshold for the involvement of the procurement team, procurement roadshows planned over the next 3 months, and training plans, and also strengthening of the arrangements for conflicts of interest as part of the procurement process. So we have seen a response from Historic Environment Scotland on those matters.
Just to be clear, these same weaknesses in procurement that are mentioned in the AAR, they're what prompted an internal audit review of procurement. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Do you have any information when that review will be completed? And will you be considering the outcome of that review in your next audit?
Yes, absolutely. We will be considering the review. We understand that the Chair's reference review will be concluding late spring of this year. Absolutely, we'll take a keen interest in the conclusions that it draws, together with broader follow-up arrangements that we would do through the annual audit of, as Lisa mentions, that her recommendations have been implemented. And then of course, reflection and consideration of any evidence that the committee chooses to take, because what's important is that the annual audit is an audit of historic environment Scotland, but the Section 22 report goes into wider issues, particularly some of the decisions that the Scottish Government took through sponsorship around the accountable officer. We'll look across all of those issues and think about any follow-up.
Just moving on to look at data breaches. Paragraph 19 states that HAS has reported 8 personal data breaches between March and November 2025 to the Information Commissioner's Office. That's quite a lot of breaches within a fairly tight period. Is there any connection why that should take place?
There is a lot of breaches, and I think what Lisa mentions in her annual audit report, there's a couple of significant things. One is the volume of them, that these are, it would be unusual for an organisation to have that many data breaches in a particular year. And some of the circumstances, and again I'll turn to Lisa and say a bit more about this, is that some of those were investigated by Historic Environment Scotland and reported to the Information Commissioner's offices. But I think it's quite significant that the Scottish Government was informed of the circumstances, but was not satisfied with the conclusion that Historic Environment Scotland reached on the matter. And as we note, and I'm happy to turn to Lisa if we've made any more up-to-date information, is that the investigations and the work of the Information Commissioner's Office is still ongoing on this matter. So I'm not sure if we have terribly much more information that we can share with the committee beyond a recognition that this feels like an important and part of the context, perhaps on the cultural context of the organisation during 2025. But again, I'll bring Lisa in if there's any more information that we have.
Yeah, thank you. So I would refer to Historic Environment Scotland's governance statement. So there's a requirement to disclose significant data breaches within that document, and that reveals that 5 of the incidents related to sensitive HR matters being published in the press, and that includes reference to senior leaders of the organisation. And my understanding is that those matters remain open. There was another incident that related to the transferring of sensitive data to another organisation without appropriate arrangements in place, and further incidents that related to unauthorised sharing of personal data and information being sent out with the organisation to personal employer email addresses. As the Auditor-General has said, the nature and volume of those breaches is reflective of the internal challenges that the organisation is facing. In my annual audit report, I also refer to a further data breach, which is in addition to those that was reviewed. It related to board members sending emails to personal email addresses. That was reviewed by Historic Environment Scotland, and it was concluded that it wasn't of significance to be reported to the Information Commissioner's Office. The Scottish Government weren't satisfied with that response. However, my understanding is that that matter has now been reported to the ICO through a different route and has been concluded.
Who in HAS concluded that it didn't require to be reported?
So that was the Information Security Manager. Apologies, I may have not got that job title entirely correct, and the Chair of the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee.
Would that not have been reported to the board?
I'm not sure if it was at the time.
It might be something like Historic Environment Scotland will have kind of more detail in the internal discussions and engagement they had on this matter. I would maybe just reiterate, Mr Beattie, that something didn't go right in this particular investigation. The fact that the Scottish Government sponsored team were not persuaded about how well that investigation had gone on, and then, albeit that, as Lisa mentions, the Information Commissioner's Office decided that there was no further action, that it was then reported subsequently, even though Historic Environment Scotland decided initially that it was not necessary to report. There seems to be maybe an appropriate case just to review how well the organisation is handling data breaches, and there is clear guidelines and arrangements for when a matter is or isn't reported to the Information Commissioner's Office.
Just to be clear in my mind, there's two different investigations here. One is the investigation on the question of the board members, and the other is presumably other data breaches. What were these other data breaches? Or are they the same?
Again, maybe Lisa, if there's anything more she wants to add about some of the detail of that.
Yes, so the detail I think we have is that they relate to sensitive HR matters being published in the press. So that was 5 of those, with reference to senior leaders. So that's the majority of those data breaches.
So 5 related to the board?
So 5 related to sensitive HR matters, not necessarily board members, senior leaders within the organisation. And those were data breaches that were matters being published in the press. So that was...
Still with the Information Commissioner.
Yes.
What sort of sanctions could they impose as a result of that?
I think I'd need to check, Mr Beattie, about the nature of those. There is at times a formula about the kind of level of expenditure and turnover that they can use, but it's perhaps something we'd need to check and come back in writing to the committee on.
Do we have any idea what that sort of timescale we're looking about to find if this is going to be an issue?
I don't, and I wouldn't want to suggest any timescales for another organisation that's reviewing us. I would just fully expect that they'll carry out their work as quickly as possible and report appropriately.
I thought there might have been some sort of standard or guideline.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, if they will set that performance standard in public. I guess it will depend on the complexity of any investigation, how long it will take.
And of course the Scottish Government itself is investigating the personal data breach involving board members. Some of that's three board members, is it? Making up the balance of the 8?
So as Lisa mentioned, there was some, in terms of senior staff and the use of board members, personal email addresses and so forth. I think it's clear that the Scottish Government and the sponsor team in this case took a considered and robust view, so that they weren't satisfied with the appropriateness of the investigation that Historic Environment Scotland had undertaken and sought further assurance that then resulted in the referral to the Information Commissioner's Office. In some respects, that validates the sponsorship arrangement. That's what you would expect, that level of additional control from a sponsored team. But I think, if I may kind of step back for a second, I think this is part of the kind of cultural concerns and issues that we reference and that are referenced in both reports.
I guess we don't have any information on when we might hear from the Scottish Government on that.
I think that aspect is I guess a matter for the Scottish Government to confirm any ongoing activity that it has on that point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, Mr Beattie. I'll now pass the floor to Graham Simpson.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just want to follow up on some of that. There's mention of stories appearing in the press, and I just wonder, I mean, sometimes stories can appear in the press because they've been deliberately leaked to the press. Was that the case here?
So we don't know. I don't have insight into the origin of how media reporting on the organisation came about, but I think what I probably won't, I don't think any of us will be able to take a view on that until the Information Commissioner's Office has concluded what were the sources how information came into the public domain. But as Lisa mentions and set out in the report, and has been subject to public commentary, Mr Simpson, there is a lot of personal data sensitive HR matters, some of which are subject to HR investigations that remain live in the organisation.
Right.
So the source and outcome, I think, remains to be seen.
Okay. And I wonder if there's a connection then to your section in your report where you refer to a toxic workplace culture, but you didn't give any details of that. So this is your opportunity to perhaps explain what you meant by toxic workplace culture. What exactly was going on?
So the committee may be familiar with what I think referred to as allegations of a toxic workplace culture. So these are not my words, but rather
Correct, yeah.
What have been referred to by members of staff of the organisation, and the wider concerns about the engagement, the experience that they are having in the organisation. Some of the cultural points that I think we have in both reports today about the use of procurement cards, some of the practices around expenses within the organisation. We also include in both reports reference to the use of hospitality, tickets for events. But these are only indicators of cultural concerns. With any concern that's raised, whether it's HR matter, data breaches, or wider concerns about culture and workplace practice, there are avenues for reporting. So, all these organisations will have whistleblowing policies, but that they are subject to proper investigation. So we think that's part of the context of the report and some of the commentary that's been around historic environment Scotland during 2025. And again, I think, as I mentioned when we discussed this briefly in December before Transport in advance of this morning's session, that the Chair's recognition of this and his response feels very significant, that there is an opportunity to review the culture and one that he is taking during the early part of this year. Of course, that matters that staff are engaged through that process. They'll have a full, clear opportunity to have their views expressed, and then, like the committee, I'm sure we'll await a conclusion of that review and consider what that means for the next stage of our work.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask about the complementary tickets, because you devote some space to that. You say that Historic Environment Scotland gets complimentary tickets to events at its venues. These are actually part of a contractual arrangement with people who are putting on the events. So if you put on an event at one of their venues, then Historic Environment Scotland will get a number of tickets, it would appear. Do you know what the scale of it was and who was actually getting these tickets?
I'll bring Lisa in to say a bit more about this, but some of the detail if we have it. But I think what we're surprised about in the reporting of this, I suppose, is the lack of clarity around arrangements for the use of these tickets, how they're being distributed, how they're being recorded, who's using them, because it is a context of their work, as you say. So they do have many attractive venues in this city, of course, that will be used for significant public events that will be part of the contractual arrangement. But a lack of transparency feels like an important context of how many tickets are being allocated, who they're being given to, and how they're being used. And we think there needs to be a more robust set of arrangements, clear, satisfactory consideration of whether that's in line with policy and that policies are appropriate for a public body and how they're using these tickets. But I'll bring Lisa in to see some of the specifics that we found during the audit.
Yeah, thank you, Auditor General. So in our report, we make reference to complementary tickets that form part of a contractual agreement that's in place. And our sense is that, that there may be other tickets that aren't part of that agreement as well. So our understanding from discussions with Historic Environment Scotland is that these tickets are allocated to support business development, to recognise and thank volunteers, and also as reward and recognition for staff members. We've also been told that depending on ticket availability, staff and external guests may be permitted to bring along a +1 as well. So we've reported on the absence of a policy to manage the distribution of those tickets and to ensure that they're distributed appropriately and more importantly, transparently, so that there's clear justification for why individuals are given one of those tickets and what value that brings to Historic Environment Scotland as an organisation.
But do you know how many tickets have been dished out over, say, the course of a year?
So I don't have that exact figure to hand, but that's a question, I think, for Historic Environment Scotland.
It might be a question for you, though, if you did the audit, and you've raised it as an issue.
So we've seen the evidence of the contract that's in place and the tickets associated with that contract, but what we don't have is a complete picture of all the tickets that may have been allocated.
So we've got no sense of the scale or the value of the tickets?
We don't have a complete sense of the scale, no.
No.
We think it's important, though. You know, if you look at the number of events that will take place in Historic Environment Scotland's facilities, the volume of people that will be going. What we don't have, and it wouldn't typically be subject of an annual audit, is to look at the specifics of how an individual event, what the capacity of that event was used, and then what happens for those tickets. But it's a context for the organisation, Mr Simpson. Historic Environment Scotland, if they have that, can tell you, the committee, I'm sure, about how many tickets and how they were allocated. What we're drawing attention to in the audit, first of all, there's no policy for this. So that feels as a weakness in arrangements. And I think it's also mentioned in the following paragraph in the report. While there's a register of interests maintained for board members, there was no formal register of interest in place for the executive leadership team. I wouldn't want to necessarily conflate both of those issues, but this is a public body that is operating as more and more public bodies are doing, and as I mentioned to the convener a few minutes ago, that in its framework document, there's a clear mandate from the Scottish Government to generate as much revenue as possible. When public bodies are operating in such an environment, they need to do safely. So effective registers of interest in place, clear policies for the distribution and use of hospitality.
Sorry, if I can just press you on this. So contractually, if somebody hires a venue, Historic Environment Scotland are entitled to a number of complimentary tickets. Contractually, do we know how many tickets they're entitled to?
So I think that's what we're saying. We don't have the precise number of tickets per contract. Whether it's consistent from one contract to the other,
okay.
I don't know. But I think that's something I'm quite sure that organisation will have a clear line of sight to. Apologies, I don't wish to repeat myself, but it's very clear from our perspective that not having a policy in place for distribution, I think, brings risk to the organisation.
Yeah.
The risk of perception about how are they using those tickets, which members of staff, as Lisa mentioned, family members also, or guests using them. Feels like when a public body is into that style of environment, they need to have stronger safeguards around any threat or perception to their reputation.
Yeah. I think you'd accept, though, that the scale matters, because if it's just like 2 or 3 tickets per event, that's not a big deal. But if it's like 50 or 100, then it becomes more of a concern.
I mean, you think you could argue that it matters or it doesn't, influenced by the scale, but actually, I would say it ought not to be a significant matter to develop policy. Just have a policy and say this is how we are, given that this is a feature of their business, to say how these additional tickets to the public body are going to be used, recorded, monitored, so that it's all above board and doesn't invite suspicion or concern to the organisation.
Okay. I will move on. I'm going to move on to the spending practices. And I must say, when I was reading the report, it did remind me of our sessions on the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. So, I mean, you mentioned foreign travel in your report. You say it's been undertaken without being authorised. I was struggling to think why there would be a need for any foreign travel from Historic Environment Scotland, but be that as it may, can you give us any examples of where foreign travel has been undertaken without proper permission?
Yeah, I'll pass to Lisa again, actually, because we did look at the business case for foreign travel, and there were business cases for foreign travel. I think what our concern, though, was that the approval for foreign travel and the amounts that were approved weren't then the amounts that were subsequently paid and not subject to the proper level of scrutiny. And we recognise, circumstances can change, especially in a foreign country, but that's appropriately approved, and we see a gap in arrangements. But again, I'll bring Lisa and say a bit more about, if we have that, but kind of the nature of some of that foreign travel and our wider audit interest.
Thank you. So, yeah, as we say, this is obviously an area where robust controls are really important, both in terms of public perception, but also the value for money considerations. So we identified non-compliance with the business travel policy, and that was particularly in relation to the authorisation of trips. So we identified trips where director and chief executive approval is required on the business case for foreign travel within the organisation, and we identified instances where this wasn't the case. As the Auditor General says, we would also expect some difference between the estimate and the actual amount spent, but we would expect robust controls around that and review following the trip as well. So some examples of foreign travel that we reviewed was teaching traditional skills in America, digital roundtables also in America, the study of mortar in Norway, and discussions, conferences and speaking events in the Middle East, Zambia and Hong Kong.
The study of mortar in Norway? Is that a joke? Well, you're not joking.
No.
I can't believe it. And the teaching traditional skills in America. What traditional skills, do we know?
I think probably these are questions for Historic Environment Scotland rather than us about the nature of the specifics and value of the trip. It's not what we are drawing attention to is, if the business deems it necessary, and that's a matter for them. So they do have arrangements in place that you need a business case, and as Lisa mentions, that will have various levels of authorisation. Some of it up to the accountable officer that it's appropriate. But that's then followed through so that the amounts that are approved are appropriate, and that they're then, if there's variation, again, subject to appropriate level. But the detail of why a member of staff went abroad is absolutely a matter for the organisation and its leaders.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll get the chance to quiz them on that. Do you know the amount of money that's been spent on foreign travel?
So, yeah, at the time of our audit, we weren't provided with a complete list of the foreign travel costs, but Historic Environment Scotland have subsequently, as they're required to do so, published on their website that £37,000 was spent on foreign travel in 24-25.
£7,000. Okie doke. Can I just, in closing, ask you about something else? There was a leaving do where people attending essentially had to be shamed into paying back the booze bill run up at taxpayers' expense. Do you know who the leaving do was for, and where was it?
I'll ask Lisa if we know where the venue is, but the leaving do was to mark the departure of one of the board members. So there's an event for some board members, as we set out paragraph 24 in November of 2024. As you mentioned, the invoice for the event totalled £875 for 11 attendees based on food price of £35, with the balance of around £500 being in respect to the purchase of alcohol. As you say, Mr Simpson, this amount was repaid by board members. We go on to say that...
So it was only repaid after a review, though?
Correct. So it was repaid, or Historic Environment Scotland was reimbursed with the organisation bearing the costs for food. In terms of where it was at, and I'll ask Lisa if we have that information.
Yeah, thank you. So the meal was held at a restaurant in Edinburgh, part of the University of Edinburgh Hospitality and Events Collection on the 20th of November.
So it was at the university?
Yeah, at Bonnage Restaurant.
Bonnage. Okay. Right, that's good. And there have been other instances as well, according to your report, where people have racked up, booze bills at the public purse.
The policy is such that the organisation will provide wine at official hospitality, either in a restaurant or a reception. But the audit work also identified, both their internal audit and external audit, further bar recharges, including spirits, being charged without appropriate challenge. So again, I think for me, it's part of the culture of the organisation.
That's it.
Of whether it has robust arrangements, either it has or hasn't appropriate policies as a public body, and then more importantly, that the policies are being complied with. And I think that's, again, Mr Simpson, why I think it's so important this review of culture initiated by the new chair follows through in these events and sets out appropriate parameters for this public body to follow.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a cultural issue. It's the same culture that we discovered at Wicks, and that appears to have existed here. Do you think it's now stopped?
I don't think I can give you that assurance yet. I think what we can say, there's a number of important signs. So there's the acceptance of the audit recommendations through the annual audit. There's the important public contributions by the new chair, actually, but the organisation is still dealing with fluctuations and instability in its leadership. So it has to be clear, importance as ever, for the tone from the top, that there's clarity around policies and implementation of those. We'll absolutely follow up on audit recommendations, progress, and I'll take a view, as I always do, about the need for further public reporting on a public body.
Okay. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. And just for the record, I can reassure members of the committee that agenda item 5, that we will, however, be taken in private, we'll be looking at next steps in terms of how we may garner more information from either Historic Environment Scotland or the Scottish Government, and what opportunities are open to us to do so. So we'll discuss those later in the meeting, particularly around some of the areas that Mr Simpson asked of Audit Scotland. So obviously anything of interest, Audit General will let you know. I will now invite Joe Fitzpatrick to have some questions.
Thank you, Convener. Some of the questions have been touched on already, but we'll maybe go into them in a little bit more depth. But it does feel like the issue here is about cultural issues that appear to be long-standing, long before this audit, and the particular issues around the accountable officer, but also a lack of transparency. And I don't see how the organisation can move forward without improving its transparency, because that's what kind of ultimately get trust. So the kind of first area around that I was wanting to touch on was, and you mentioned it, the register of interest and the lack of a register of interest of the executive leadership team. How unusual is that in terms of a public body that there wouldn't be that register at that top level?
So it's noteworthy. The fact that we make reference to it in the report is indicative of it's out of the norm. But I think, again, I'll maybe bring Carol in, actually, maybe say from her look across Scottish Government and other public bodies about the extent to which that is commonplace or other. I think it's particularly relevant for this organisation, though, the fact that it's dealing with contractual arrangements, that it's generating £70 million of revenue in a commercial setting, public officials should want to feel safeguarded in that environment, that they can be absolutely clear, that they are transparent. And the point that you make, Mr Fitzpatrick, that there is no suggestion or risk to either individual or organisational reputation by doing so. So it really matters that there's clarity around, yes, board members, which is welcome that it was in place, but also extending into senior leaders and those especially involved in procurement arrangements. But again, to bring to Carolyn if she wants to offer a wider perspective. Thank
you, Auditor General. What I would say, looking across the public sector, is we've seen registrars' interest featuring more and being strengthened. As the Auditor General said, where procurement contracts are being entered into, it's incredibly important. But I think in particular for Historic Environment Scotland, the nature of their hospitality, you would want that openness and transparency round about any potential risks long before people are entering into conversations or in the room having those conversations. So we would have, given the nature of Historic Environment Scotland, we would have expected it to be in place and to be even more important. But I would say across the public sector, we are seeing a stronger set of arrangements round about related parties featuring.
I wonder if you would be prepared to go further in suggesting that all public bodies, ultimately leadership teams, if they've got a, I mean, you're only registering an interest because it's relevant. So if you've got a relevant, particularly a financial interest, then it should be declared. It's not. I don't think it's unusual that you get people in positions that have an interest because they've got an interest because, and that's how they've gained their skills or whatever it was that made them valuable for that leadership post. So I wonder if this is an opportunity to send that signal out to public bodies across Scotland that the leadership teams, if there's any interest, then it's in their interest to declare that and have that clear and transparent.
We'd be happy to support that. Actually, I think it's certainly something worthy of further engagement with the Scottish Government on.
Thanks for that. The next area I was wanting to probe a little bit further on, and it has been covered quite a lot actually, is around the arrangements around the electronic purchase cards, and I think you've kind of talked already about this huge amount of money that was spent on these cards, going, the fact that the level was raised to over, I think, £1,200. That still seems an incredibly high level for someone just to be doing on their own. As MSPs, we can have a Parliament credit card, but every single payment, even if it's £20, is signed off and checked by somebody else, and it just seems a bizarrely high level for payments to be being made and not properly. It seems there's a complete lack of control. I mean, even if the policy had been followed, which we've heard it wasn't.
Yeah, I'd agree with your assessment that. So I think there's a few things for the organisation to consider as it evaluates and in due course, I'm sure, update its arrangements. The necessity for that volume of purchasing cards to be in place, the transaction limits, the volume of credit limits on the cards, the extent to which compliance checks are carried out as well. I'm familiar with the level of scrutiny that MSP's expenses will be under. What we say in the annual audit report, then, by contrast, is that around 8% of EPC transactions each month were subject to compliance checks. So I think the organisation, there's perhaps two things. One is that by having such a volume of cards in place, can they sufficiently exercise compliance against the volume of transactions that are taking place? And as the annual audit report notes out, the focus had been on is there sufficient supporting documentation in place, rather than whether or not they're complying with the policy for items of expenditure. I think this is an area that's a real of necessary review for the organisation, Mr Fitzpatrick, that just to say how are goods and services being procured within the organisation, and taking a clear, rational view to support business need and efficiency, that is the right number.
So the point that you made there, I think, is what the policy should be for. But I guess from a public perception, the lack of control, there would be a public concern that there may have been purchases made on the credit cards which were not appropriate and couldn't have been justified by the organisation if nobody's checking what's being spent. I mean, being mindful of language, but the public might think that there would be a risk there of effective fraud in terms of use of those cards. Was there any indication that that's the case, or do we just not know because there's no controls?
So I'll bring Lisa in and say a bit more about some of the transactions that were of particular focus and interest. I've alluded to a couple of those in terms of accommodation and kitchen replacement that felt particularly unusual. If we can say a bit more about some of that detail. But I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, both in the opening statement and then to the committee in December on this matter, these arrangements bring about increased risk in terms of not having a sufficiently robust control environment and the risk of fraud that the organisation wasn't sufficiently guarding against. So Lisa can say a bit more about some of the detail and concerns. Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. So just to be clear, these purchasing card transactions are subject to approval, and that's part of the basis of our reporting point around that culture of where policies are not being consistently applied. So we're seeing that across different approvers within the organisation. We refer to the compliance with the electronic purchasing card policy. So any transaction over £1,000, and that's consistent with the Scottish Public Finance Manual as well, should be supported by 3 quotes from different suppliers, and they should be written quotes that are obtained and retained that should then be subject to review as part of that approval and compliance checking process. That information wasn't available as part of the audit, so that made it very difficult from our perspective to confirm the appropriateness of the expenditure.
But sorry, just to pick up on the point you said, but they were being checked.
Checked, yes.
So there was at least a person looking at it. They weren't just going through and being clear.
That's standard with electronic purchasing.
Okay, that I guess gives a little bit of assurance to the public on that point. Convener,
you've got a moment or two if you've got another question. Yeah.
I'll pass back to yourself.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We're just going to backtrack a smidge because I think there's one or two technical issues I'd just like to clarify with you while you're here, Auditor General, if you don't mind. And that's to refer you. I'm not sure if Audit Scotland followed the Constitution and Culture Committee session around historic environment in Scotland that was held on the 6th of November 2025. I'm sure you paid attention to that. And as a result of that, there were some comments made within that session I would like to reflect on in this session and perhaps ask for your opinion on what was said in that meeting. And I apologise I haven't provided the quotations to you in advance to look at, but I will do my best to paraphrase if it's helpful. In that session, the Scottish Government's Director for Culture and Affairs, Mr Hogg, was asked about the issue around the appointment of the interim accountable officer. Now, my first point is this, and I wondered if you could reflect on this response, and that's that, again, I am paraphrasing, but we may put the full quote into the official report, that Mr Hogg said that he was reassured that there were no upcoming decisions that required an accountable officer to exercise oversight, and that he had also received assurances from the former chair of HES that there were no decisions that required an accountable officer to be in place. He doesn't state whether he was satisfied with that response or not, but what I would ask you is that normal practice for a decision on whether there should be an interim accountable officer to be made on reassurances that there's no need for one because there are no decisions to be made? It sounds like an extremely unusual reason for not appointing one.
Yeah, so obviously, as you mentioned, Convener, I don't have Mr Hogg's contribution set out in the official report, but I'm familiar with the tone that you refer. And I think what I would do is probably just reiterate, I think, some of the sentiment, the contribution I made earlier in the meeting, that as set out in the Scottish Public Finance Manual, the duties of the accountable officer in the Scottish public sector effectively mean that they're personally responsible to the Scottish Parliament for the proper stewardship of public funds. the regularity, propriety of expenditure, that it's providing value for money, that there's effective financial management and reporting in place, which does make reference to the annual report and accounts, which is a clear part of it, but not solely, that there's effective governance and risk arrangements in place, that they will have accountability to Parliament, called to appear before either this committee or other committees of the Parliament, and that they will, while may be able to delegate responsibility, they retain the accountability. So individual transactions that are referred to by Mr Hogg are important and they matter, but there's a wider set of responsibilities that are enduring for an accountable officer to either prepare or respond to events. So it remains my view, Convener, that the Scottish Government, when it became clear that the accountable officer was going to be absent for more than a month, ought to have appointed a substitute arrangement to give assurance to the board that the organisation was continuing to operate as intended in line with its strategic plans and framework. A document can give assurance to the sponsor team, but ultimately to the Parliament, that the organisation was operating in line with its expectations.
Far from me to put words in your mouth, Auditor General, but are you saying in summary that because there were no immediate decisions to be made, that does not replace the need for an accountable officer to exist at all?
I'm absolutely clear on that while individual transactions matter, accountable officer responsibilities are enduring throughout the term of appointment of an accountable officer and cannot be distilled down to individual large transactions from time to time.
So in this instance, does that demonstrate that the Scottish Public Finance Manual was not just not being followed, but perhaps had been misunderstood even by the sponsorship division?
I think there's been a lot of reference to the fact that the accountable officer, upon her return from work, was discharging those responsibilities in respect of the annual report and accounts. Yes, that they matter. You, of course, would expect me to say that the annual report and accounts matter, that these accounts will be laid before Parliament and are subject to scrutiny along with today's report. But I'm clear, it's not just that. These are much wider responsibilities. And although there was, and I think the point that's come through, hopefully in our report and the evidence you've taken this morning, Convener, is that there was some ambiguity about whether the accountable officer's period of absence would or wouldn't endure. But really, regardless, as we've seen in other organisations, I should point out to the committee that if there was going to be a known period of absence for an accountable officer, we've seen the Scottish Government appoint interim accountable officers. And I guess we remain unclear as to why the Scottish Government, when it became clear, as it did, that the accountable officer was going to be absent for a prolonged period, they didn't appoint an interim.
Thank you for that. And those are, again, are questions we may have for the government itself. There is, again, I apologise if it's probably easier if I read the quote directly from what was said in that meeting, but again, I would be interested in your reflections on it. Mr Hogg also said that at one point the board had determined that it wished to proceed to appoint an acting chief executive. The Director General within the sponsorship department met the candidate, interviewed them in respect of their suitability, and took a view that that person was suitable to be appointed as accountable officer and was recommended to the chair and the board to do so. The next line is interesting. It goes on to say that the board subsequently decided not to proceed with that appointment. Again, that seems like an unusual state of affairs where a senior Director General of a government department has made a recommendation around an interim chief executive that's then been refused by the board. Now, I guess at this point it comes down to who's in charge, really. What would be the normal procedure or practice in that scenario where there's a conflict of views?
So I think it can vary. Actually, it depends on the status of the organisation. So Historic Environment Scotland is a charitable, non-departmental public body. Forgive me, I'd need to refer to the specifics and maybe turn to Lisa if we have more detail, but about where the appointment arrangements and responsibility for those reside. I think what seems to be suggested by Mr Hogg is that the board were responsible for appointing the Chief Executive, and then the subsequent designation of accountable officer is one that comes from the Principal Accountable Officer, the Permanent Secretary, to that person as the Chief Executive. But if you allow me, Convener, I'll maybe just turn to Lisa just to check my understanding is correct.
Yeah, so I think per the framework agreement, that's our understanding of the responsibilities. So the appointment of the accountable officer sits with the Scottish Government and the Chief Executive with Historic Environment Scotland. I think the specific individual that you refer to, my understanding is that person was put forward, that was a suggestion of the board, and considered to be acceptable by the Scottish Government. I'm not clear on what happened and what followed that and why that appointment wasn't made.
Okay, that sounds like a series of events we may wish to dig into further. But of course, the framework agreement between Historic Environment Scotland and the Scottish Government, my understanding is that that was renewed at some point in the calendar year 2025. Is that correct?
I think it was just slightly prior to that.
Slightly prior. But that, I guess my point being is that occurred in the absence of an accountable officer or any senior leadership in HES.
I think maybe just to correct slightly, Convener, I think the framework agreement was approved in October of 2024, so the accountable officer would have been in post at that time.
Okay. A permanent accountable officer or an interim?
Well, there would have been the permanent one,
right.
But the post holder who subsequently went on a period of leave of absence.
Is Audit Scotland satisfied with the nature of the framework agreement, or did you have any comments or recommendations with regards to it?
It's not something we would typically take a view on whether it's appropriate or otherwise. What we'd say, we'd recognise that it follows the model framework, a document for non-departmental public bodies. I think what we do draw out of it that is significant is the reference to, if I can find the right paragraph, Convener, in terms of additional income generation. So, for example, optimising, I'll just read this out, paragraph 65 of the framework document, optimising income, not including grant and aid from all sources, should be a priority. That feels significant contextual information for the organisation. As we've spoken about with the committee on a number of times over recent months, where public bodies are engaging in commercial practices, and these wouldn't be new to Historic Environment Scotland. This is something that's done for decades, but that it has the right structures, policies, and compliance with those policies, so that it can safeguard individual and the organisation's reputation and do so safely.
Thank you for that. That's noted. There was one final question for me, and that's again, it's a technical clarification, and that's in that committee session, there was a conversation around the HES's scheme of delegation of directors, which I presume was an interim arrangement, so that decisions could be made in the absence of senior leadership or executive. And what is unclear to us, perhaps as a committee, is whether that scheme of delegation would or would not take precedent over the requirements of the SPFM.
So I perhaps need to take advice and come back to the committee on writing. I don't think that any scheme of delegation would be, in my initial view, would set aside the requirements of the Scottish Public Finance Manual, but that doesn't preclude the possibility, if there's any specific wording in a framework document, scheme of delegation, or a letter of appointment of accountable officer that deviates from that. So it's probably something, if you're content, Convener, just for me to come back to the committee on.
If you're willing to, that would be helpful. Thank you, Auditor General. On that note, then, I shall conclude this session. I'd like to thank Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, his accompanied officials, Lisa Duthie, Audit Director, and Carol Grant, Audit Director, for answering your questions so comprehensively on the Section 22 report into HES. The committee will consider its next steps in due course. Thank you. What I shall now do is suspend the meeting until 11 o'clock to allow for a change of witnesses and a short comfort break. Thank you. Welcome back to the Public Audit Committee this morning. We now move on to Agenda Item 3, which is our consideration of the inquiry into the Cairngorm Funicular Railway. May I welcome to the committee this morning, extending a warm welcome to our three witnesses, Mr Nick Kemp, who is a campaigner and mountaineer, Mr Gordon Bullock, who is a former environmental land remediation and business turnaround manager, and Mr Dave Morris, who is a Cairngorm and international mountain expert. All three gentlemen, I believe, are members of Parks Watch Scotland. And correct me if I've got any of that wrong. But before we get into some questions from our committee members, I would like to invite Mr Nick Kemp to make a short opening statement first. Mr Kemp.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to clarify, Parks Watch Scotland is a blog that I run, and there was a group of people who are associated with that, so it's not an organisation as such. It doesn't have a membership. Yeah.
Under that umbrella phrase for the points of this morning.
That's fine. Thank you very much for asking us to give evidence to your inquiry into the funicular today. We have supplemented our original submission with some further evidence which has been published on the web, your website, and we may refer to that. Right. I'll start with a confession. I learned to ski at Cairngorm some 55 years ago, and I'm the youngest of the team here, probably by a significant way. I also have a declaration, and that's along with Dave Morris. I have to excuse his laryngectomy, so he has some problems speaking with his throat. Who's been involved in Cairngorm since the 1970s. Both of us objected to the funicular railway when it was first proposed. So we've got a long history on this. And Gordon is part of the Cairngorms campaign now, which has also opposed the funicular. When the PAC's predecessor, the PAPL, considered Audit Scotland's report on HIE's management of Cairngorm on the 1st of October 2020, the focus of the session was on HIE's management of the outsourcing of Cairngorm Mountain to natural retreats. Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, I've just had a word behind, gave evidence to that session and explained that the business case had been agreed, the draft business case had agreed to repair the funicular at an estimated capital cost of 15 million. It was actually 16.16 million. And what Mr Boyle, I think, didn't know at the time was that the subsidy required for the first 5 years was £9.76 million, and that the business case was based on an ongoing subsidy of over £73 million, right? And although MSPs asked some searching questions that day, basically, as my understanding is, that business case has never been scrutinised independently. So what we were saying today, and I should say that business case was then, that large amount of public subsidy was justified on the basis of the gross value added to the local economy. And again, the figures of that have never been made public, and we don't understand why what those benefits are. So 2 key points we'd just like to get across about the funicular today, and following the repairs and so on, is that we believe the design is fundamentally flawed. And as we've explained in our report, we don't think the repairs are likely to last for as long as anticipated. That will result in further costs and undermines the business case. Secondly, that the amount of public subsidy that is involved is huge. It is likely to increase, right, because there's now going to be further maintenance and so on is required, and that money could be far better spent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening comments. And I should say to all our guests, please do help yourselves to some water. If anyone needs anything, particularly get the attention of our clerks. And if you need to depart for a short comfort break, feel free to. And if needs be, I can suspend the meeting so you don't miss anything. So we're very flexible and helpful here in this committee. Okay. I will pass the floor now to Mr Graham Simpson, who will have the first opening set of questions.
Well, thanks very much, Convener, and can I thank you all for coming today. You're aware that we've visited the funicular which was very interesting. It was good to go. And we met some local business people in Aviemore. It was good. It was a very useful trip. But we're keen to hear your side of the argument, as it were. So you've given us a submission. Now our questions will be separated into different areas. I'm going to ask you about your thoughts on governance, transparency, and accountability. You don't all have to answer. It could just be one of you answers. So my first question is, you've described what you think is a cloak of secrecy around HIE's governance. Can you say what you mean by that? And can you give us any examples of lack of transparency?
Yes. We've had difficulty. Most information about Cairngorm is not regularly published, right? We have had to extract it by means of a series of freedom of information requests. And for example, we only got the full business case, which I believe may now be on the website, which is highly redacted as a result of a freedom of information request. The minutes of the board meetings, there are all sorts of arrangements for dealing with the funicular. They're highly redacted. I think, as I referred to in the report, I checked before coming, the last minute that deals with Cairngorm is in August, and basically all the key points of that, it refers to your inquiry, but all the key points of that are redacted, so you can't really understand what's happening, apart from the fact that Cairngorm Mountain Scotland is now going to prepare a new business case for the next 3 years. How that fits with the full business case, of which it's supposed to last 30 years, right? Well, it's not clear from the minute at all. I mean, we could give further examples, but basically there is a lack of transparent financial information. And I think one of the issues here, which we just like to highlight in terms of the governance, is the structure. Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited is set up as an independent company, although wholly controlled by HIE. But actually, it doesn't operate like a company at all. And it is completely controlled by HIE. And in terms of its finances, right, at the moment, for the last 4 years, HIE has just been paying whatever grant is needed to make the to make the accounts balance. So I think you may have read if you've seen the spreadsheet at the end of the report. So the year-end balance for the last 6 years, has been 54,133. And that is because HIE pays whatever is needed, right, to maintain that balance, which we think is pretty extraordinary in terms of this is not a company, independent company in the true sense of the word. And one of the key issues, I think, for the committee to consider is whether actually what would be needed to make it an independent company, or whether actually it should just be brought in under HIE's core business.
So what do you think should be an independent company?
Well, it would need to be far more independent than it is at the moment.
Is it the funicular you think should be independent?
Well, at the moment we're talking about Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited would need to be. Our view on the funicular is, and when HIE outsourced Cairngorm to Natural Retreats, they maintain financial responsibility for the funicular. The funicular is such a financial liability that it would be impossible, in our view, to put in to an independent company. That's just not possible, right? So HIE needs to maintain financial responsibility for it. And that explains, because it's doing so through a subsidiary, I think that helps explain why basically now the way it's financing is just pays whatever is needed each year to keep the funicular going.
Doesn't that rather knock your argument on the head then? If you're saying that Cairngorm Mountain Scotland should be an independent company, and then in the next breath you say, well, actually it couldn't be because it couldn't stand on its own 2 feet.
There is a dilemma there, but HIE is impacted not just on the funicular, but it is on the whole management of the mountain, and which in respect to future plans. And we think actually one of the problems in the last 20 years is HIE's focus has been entirely on the funicular, and what has been needed is a far broader plan for Cairngorm, which we'll maybe pick up in other questions.
Okay. And if anyone else wants to come in, I mean, it's good that Mr. Kemp is leading. No, that's absolutely fine. But if anyone else has got anything to contribute, that's okay. So you've mentioned the governance. Mr. Bullock's taking my invitation.
You don't need to press your button, so just let the technician do that for you.
If I could just add that HIE's role, as I always see it, is to fund enterprises throughout the Highlands and Islands, not to run them. Now, they will, I think, say, oh, that's why we are separated, we've got CMSL as a separate company. But if you look at the governance structure over it, they've got them like this, and they cannot move unless HIE gives approval. That is the difference, and I think there needs to be that separation. And we can talk about the future if CMSL should be under a different ownership rather than under HIE.
Well, somebody else will ask about the future, so I will not trample on their toes, but if I could just stick to governance. So you've spoken about your concerns about governance and the layered governance arrangements. We've got programme boards, project boards, KPIs, assurance reports, improved outcomes. Are they, do you think this needs to be streamlined?
Yes, I think our view, well, I think one of the interesting things, and the convener of the committee last time asked questions about, and this was an incredibly complicated structure, and which we didn't understand, and actually eventually, right, they produced for you a diagram of the government structure that illustrates some of the issue. There is no document setting out actually how the government works properly, and part of it, we think, is that because it is so complicated, that nobody takes responsibility. Right? This is a very, very complicated governance process, and you're thinking actually, even you think it's very, for a small operation, it's a very high amount of public subsidy. In the scheme of things, it's not that much public subsidy, and there's an incredible amount of governance being spent each year on several £1 million. And the cost of that is also, it is not clear what the cost is. It's quite, the new board members of Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited, something in the last minute, they are now on the same board fee as the members of the main board of HIE. Don't know what that costs, but the amount of money that is being spent on this government, and then they bring in advisors. Everything they do has advisors and consultants, and that also adds significantly to the governance cost.
Yeah, we're used to hearing about consultants on big fees in this committee. Have you got any thoughts about how you would improve the governance arrangements?
I'm of the view that HIE should be removed from the mountain as soon as possible. We'll come to that later on. But when you look at what's happening on the hill today, and Gordon and I were meeting with Mike Gifford yesterday, and I had a long meeting with him on the 20th of November, I'm pretty satisfied with the operational arrangements actually on the mountain. I think it could be supplemented by, if you like, a grouping of people who are basically experts on ski development and associated outdoor recreation. And that's something I'm going to take up with him subsequently. I'm going back to my experience with the land reform legislation, the right to roam legislation. And what was really critical there was we had like 10 people around the table representing different expertise, and that's how we delivered it. The problem at the moment, and I talked to Mike about this in November, is that their advisory group is full of stakeholders, not expert individuals, people who are representing organisations. And as you'll see from my written evidence, the problem with any stakeholders in Bay Knocknastrass Bay is that they don't say what needs to be done because they're also looking over their shoulders at the next grant application to HIE. That is absolutely fundamental problem.
So, how, Mr. Morris, would you remove HIE from the mountain, as you say? What would replace them?
Forestry and Land Scotland is the easiest mechanism. When I went to work for the Nature Conservancy Council in Abbeymoor in 1973, at that stage, Islands and Islands Development Board were owning the upper part of the mountain. But when I look back at the files, it was obvious that there was a much better situation from the early days of the Cairngorm development from 1961 onwards, when the Forestry Commission owned all of the land from the bottom to the top of the mountain. Now, in 2006-07, there was an effort to get the upper part of the mountain transferred to what was the Forestry Commission. And the Forestry Commission did a very good consultation with the various organisations. I was working for Ramblers Scotland at the time, and we were fully supportive of that. But then I think it literally ran into the buffers when HIE were trying to pass financial responsibility for the funicular to the Forestry Commission. So they wouldn't have that. But today, in a sense, the simplest thing is for the Scottish Government to say, we've had enough of this forest on the mountain. It's been going on for far too many decades. So Forestry and Land Scotland could take over all of the management of the mountain from an ownership point of view, but leave any issues as regarding financial responsibility regarding the funicular, leave those with HIE. HIE forevermore should keep hold of that financial responsibility, including the day when they have to remove the funicular. And then on top of that, you've got to remember there is a pretty good, pretty effective community group, the Abbeymoor and Glenmore Development Trust, which have been doing some good work at the bottom of the mountain. Now, you could, in due course, get a partnership involving them and Forestry Land Scotland, and that, I think, will be a way forward.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. I mean, just following on from Mr. Morris's point of view, and this is open to anyone in the panel, is there a collective agreement or view on that basically HIE should be lumped with the big liability of the funicular and its costs, but leave the rest of it to everyone else to get on with? Is that the general view?
Yeah, yes, and that includes the people who contribute to the report who are not here. There is no other solution. We do not. The funicular will never be financially viable, right? It's never going to be financially viable. So, giving responsibility to anyone else would be, well, no one's going to accept it.
You mean including financial responsibility?
Yeah, well, no one is going to take on something if they have to take on financial responsibility for the funicular. I mean, natural retreats, right? In my view, they were, whatever else you can say for them, like they absolutely knew, right? They did not, natural retreats, they excluded the funicular from that agreement on the mountain.
What effect would Forestry Land Scotland having greater responsibility, or if you like, ownership of the mountain range in its wider entirety have on what currently happens up there? Would there need to be any changes, or would you like to see any changes to what happens there as a result of any change?
Yeah, a very simple answer to that question is the issue of path networks. We think there are great opportunities on Cairngorm from bottom to top in terms of future path development, particularly for walking, running and mountain biking. But the situation today is pretty appalling, because this mountain slope to the top of Cairngorm has been in state ownership for more than 100 years. And yet there is not a single footpath which takes you from the bottom in Glenmore up to Corricas. If you go in Glenmore and you look at the notices put there by Forestry and Land Scotland, all the paths go round and round in Glenmore. There is no connection. And we talked to Mike Gifford about this yesterday, and he is in favour, as we are, of at least restoring the footpath from the Glenmore up to Corricas. Now, clearly it would be much easier to do if the forestry people owned the whole land. But Mike said that the problem is Forestry and Land Scotland haven't got the money to do this, to which I responded and said, well, we hope that the next Scottish Parliament will strip away from the Scottish forestry a lot of the money which it spends on and waste money on forestry, on the forestry's planting schemes. Give that money to a lot of that money to Forestry and Land Scotland, and then they could spend that on Cairngorm and other places where there is a need for much, much better management of the state forests.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you may, yes.
I mean, there are some broader issues here, and I think generally Forest and Land Scotland has got expertise in managing land, right? Cairngorm Mountain, the soils and everything is extremely sensitive. It's not being well managed at the moment. That's not really a matter for this committee, but in our view, there's a whole lot of issues about how the soils and everything else is happening. Forest and Land Scotland has far more expertise in land. But the second point I'd like to make about it is the Cairngorm National Park tried to create an integrated plan for Glenmore that was linking from the top of the mountain to Abbey Moor. It was to deal with things like traffic problems. Lots of snow last Saturday at Cairngorm. It was complete chaos, right, on terms of traffic. People couldn't get up the road. There's not enough parking. There needs to be a whole transport solution. It's just not going to happen with two landowners. It needs actually an integrated, what's happening on the bottom and the top. And unfortunately, that Cairngorm National Park plan, it wasn't really complete, and it's just disappeared into the ether, right? Nothing has happened about it. And the problem, I think, is fundamentally about those different landowners. And the national park should be the body. You know, we've got a national park that helps sort a lot of these issues out, but it's not powerful enough to take, in our view, to take on HIE.
I mean, with respect, we had an extraordinary amount of weather in the last couple of weeks, which the benefit of which brings great conditions for the mountain ranges, but does present issues around access across all the skiing areas. So, you know, playing devil's advocate, is that not just par for the course for a mountain ski resort?
Well, there are two specific issues actually which are worth highlighting at Cairngorm. First, the access road gets regularly blocked. And occasionally Glenshee Road too, but the way the road is designed, it gets regularly blocked. So quite often the number of, if you look at the annual accounts or whatever, quite often they refer to the numbers of skier days lost because people can't access the resort. There's then a specific issue with the funicular, the design. There is a tunnel at the top. Everyone will know that Cairngorm is the wind blows. Basically, snow blows into the top of that tunnel. It blocks it. The funicular can't operate. Staff spend hours in the morning trying to dig out the tunnel to try and get it working. So some of the design issues, and Scotland is getting less snow, but Cairngorm is the place that has more snow than anywhere else, really, but because of its altitude, they cannot make design issues mean they cannot make best use of it, and that restricts the income that is generated.
Okay, thank you. My esteemed colleague, Mr. Beattie, will talk to you on a technical level about some of that in a moment. I'm going to focus perhaps on the money aspects. We are, of course, the Public Audit Committee, and we have a responsibility to look at that. You have, in your representations, made some specific comments and views around the repair costs of the funicular. Now, we don't really have time to revisit all of the history of that, nor do I wish to. But it is significant to us as an audit committee that the repair costs rose so substantially from £5–6 million to 25 and perhaps rising, and I appreciate there are some live matters that we may not wish to go into around who's paying for what at the moment, so we will try and avoid that. But in your view, what was the underlying reason for such a rise, a substantial rise in costs for the repairs to the funicular?
Well, firstly, I would be inclined to say the choice from the full business plan of going to repair the funicular, there were other choices that should have been better considered. Now, there's a whole raft of things we can talk about this full business case. I think it was highly flawed and it lacks huge amounts of backup information. From my background, if I had been presented with that in the company I used to work with, it was a FTSE 100 company, it would be thrown out day one. Not enough information. But let's park that to the side. Then there's the design and build of the repairs themselves. Now, I am a trained scientist, and I always want to understand if there's a problem, if there's an issue going on, what has actually happened there, so I can predict the future. If you're just looking at the symptoms as you see them, then you don't necessarily know what the cure is. And frankly, Cowie, who did the design work, may well have their own theories, but no theories have been published from the HIE side as to why the structure so dramatically failed. We, in our papers, have actually got some very good theories as to why this has happened. And frankly, the facts fit our theories. So from a scientific point of view, unless somebody can point out some other information which is wrong, these theories fit. And from that, and from our understanding of these issues, we are concerned that the repairs just will not last. And they will require significant extra maintenance. And that's already been evident because the funicular has been shut about 4 times this year since it reopened in February for what was said to be routine maintenance, but we have the information through FOIs, was so that they could continue to have an interim certificate of construction compliance. The designer and the builder are concerned that the structure is not going to last. That's why they're not giving it a long-term certificate of compliance. They're giving it an interim one, and the latest one, of the 4th, takes it through to May of next year. That's the longest they've had since it started.
Just to be clear in what you are saying to us, that it's not just the initial design of the structure itself, but it's, in addition, the design of the repairs, which are partially at fault here.
Well, I think we believe that these repairs will reduce the structural failure and will hold it back a little bit, but the structural failure is still there, and all these strappings that have been put on are there to try and contain it. But if you look at the beams themselves, these concrete beams, they are already damaged. Within there is concrete that's damaged. You can see cracking on the underside, etc. There are big problems there. The strapping will slow that down. It will not eliminate it.
Again, Mr. Beattie will cover some of these technical aspects, so we'll park that just for a second while I finish on the financials. Can I, now, obviously we have spoken to HIE, we visited the site. I have perhaps just 2 further questions on that aspect. One is, in your more recent engagement with the new management team at the resort, who we also had the benefit of meeting and chatting to, and meeting some of the staff as well. And I think what was clear to us is the passion exhibited by those who choose to work on the mountain, who love the environment they work in and are very passionate about delivering to their local communities. But would you feel that now, despite your reservations about the HIE involvement, that the resort is in a better place, or perhaps has a better future as a result of a change of personnel?
Yeah, but I respond to that. Of course, in my giving my evidence here, I'm highly critical of HIE, but I would say they have taken some good decisions in relation to the senior management on the mountain and in relation to the board. Between us, Gordon and I know most of the board members, and we think the combination on the hill is very good. And with my view of is that I think Mike Gifford is a pretty inspiring leader, probably one of the best I've seen since the 1970s. So I think we could work very well with the new management of the company, but I am still absolutely against HIE being the overlord there. I want to see HIE's role reduced to what it should be, which is simply giving grant aid. And I've encouraged Mike to take a stronger leadership role, both in what he's doing on the mountain and in his dialogue with other interests.
Of course.
Can I just add, I fully empathise with the problems that Mike Gifford has got. I have been in that type of situation trying to turn around a much bigger business than that one. And it is a very difficult task to do. The problem, and I actually said that to Mike yesterday, was, yes, we can add on things round the mountain, we can try and get more people in there, etc. But unless the core fixed costs of that operation are tackled, then, excuse the language, you're almost pissing in the wind on it. That has to be tackled, and the core fixed cost is the cost of operating, running and maintaining that funicular. Because it doesn't provide the uplift. It's not providing what it's there to do. It's causing its own problems.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And because of that, it doesn't generate sufficient income for capital investment. And we've looked at some things, but for example, they'll talk about the mountain bike trail where they had 3,000 visitors. I mean, compared to Glen Tress and the Forest and Land Scotland, it's tiny amounts, right? They're generating tiny amounts of money. So the HIE talks a lot about diversification. They've been doing that since the funicular was first. They've been talking about it for 20 plus years. But all these bits of diversification are not going to generate the income that they need. And so our other point on this is that if Cairngorm is going to work as a business, it actually needs significant new financial capital investment, but in lift infrastructure that is appropriate for carrying lots of skiers up the mountain. But what we would also say on the lower sections of the mountain could also be used for mountain biking. And we may come across that in future plans and so on. But the key point is that the current model, right, cannot, however hard those staff tried, right, they will never be able to deal with the need for subsidy because they've got the wrong operating. It's the organisation is not set up right.
Yes, can I add to that? The Cairngorm is really, really unusual in terms of ski resorts because the top half is owned by one body and the bottom half with another. And I think it's a general principle that in ski resorts worldwide, you often have to subsidise what's actually high on the mountain. Now, I was in Colorado some years ago and went to talk to the people at Vail Ski Resort, one of the big North American resorts, and I was there in September, and I was a bit surprised that there weren't many people on the uplift system. And I went to talk to the management, and I said, well, where's all your summer operation? They said, it's not here. It's down in the next valley around this lake. And we made profit there with all the lowland stuff. And we spent that money then on the mountain. And that was my experience of that is exactly the same as David Hayes of the Landmark Development, who's, I think, one of the best tourism operators in Scotland. He wrote extensively about this issue when the funicular was proposed, and he lobbied MP MSPs are mounted, because his argument, and he commissioned a report from David Patterson, who was the Scottish Tourist Board Chief Executive, in looking into this, and the basic conclusion is that Cairngorm will never be viable financially unless money has been generated in the forest zone and then sent up the mountain. And I was talking to David about a year ago about this, and he said what's needed now is to have a system at the bottom of the hill, of the hayfield, at the bottom of the hill, a number plate recognition system, so that everybody who goes through that gateway, if you like, pays a fee in order to drive up to wherever they want to go on the mountain. That would generate a lot of money, which could be then spent on the mountain. But we've argued this for 30 years now, and we've got nowhere with HIE, because HIE are just concerned with their little bit of mountain, what they own at the top, and therefore you get one diversification plan after another. It won't work. You've got to get back to the fundamentals and learn what happens in other countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All really interesting stuff. We may come back to some of this before the end of the session, but for now I'm going to ask Mr. Beattie to ask some questions. Thank you,
Mayor. I'd like to touch on things around engineering, sustainability and future risk. You described the current engineering solution as, and I quote, unsustainable both physically and financially. What are the key technical risks that make further failures likely?
I can give some answers to that. We've got a failure of the pillars themselves, and I've written a little illustrative paper of that, in which they have tilted. And the work that's been done is there to try and constrain that. But it will not stop that tilting happening further. It'll slow it down only. And that's based on a lot of geomorphological evidence, etc. The other problem is the concrete structure itself. You've got beams there, on which the railway sits on top. And a number of these beams have started to fail. The concrete in them has crumbled. You can see the stress marks, because what has been happening over the years is this beam has been flexing as the train's gone over it, and that flexing has been beyond its design flexing. That's what this evidence is showing there. Now, they've put on these strappings to clamp it and hopefully hold it, but that damage within these beams is still there. And it's very difficult to try and get a beam back to its original strength just by clamping itself. The same thing goes for the joint, which is called the scarf joint, and that's the joint where the two beams meet at the pillar, and there's a triangular joint in there. That has had a huge amount of stresses on it. And you can see this again, where the joint has gone, it's cracked, etc. They've strapped it. That will hold it to some extent, but will not hold it indefinitely. The other problem they've got, and what they've been doing in the last year, from what I understand, and they may say differently, but there have been problems with these clamps, and they are tensioned. The nuts on these are tensioned using quite a complicated machine. Some of these nuts have slackened off. Why? And one of the things is you've got the stresses, you've got the variations in temperature, etc., etc. This is one of the things that's going to cause extra maintenance costs. They're going to have to check all of these struts, and there's 92 pillars with 92 scarf joints on them, with all these strappings on them, and a lot of the beams that are strapped. They've got to check these to make sure, are they slackening off or are they not?
So, is the material inappropriate, or is it a problem in the construction?
Well, if you go back to the beginnings of the funicular, the original design, and actually it went to planning permission as well, was for a steel structure, not concrete, a steel structure, and of course steel is a lot more flexible to variations, tensions, etc., etc. But for all the worst reasons, it was decided to go with concrete because it was supposed to be cheaper, and of course it ended up being almost double the cost when it was built originally. It is our understanding, and it would be interesting if HIE deny this or not, that when Cowie, who was the designer, was asked to look at the problems of the structure, when Cowie started to look at it, they suggested that what they should do is, all right, keep the concrete pillars, take off all the beams and put in steel. And that was deemed by HIE to be unacceptable or too costly or whatever. But it's this design that came out of that is our understanding from the information we've got. So if it had been made with steel, I think we would have a structure that was working well into the future.
Now, we've heard a discussion previously on the merits of steel versus concrete. We were also advised that there are sites right across Europe which use concrete quite successfully and without a problem. So, you know, that argument's kind of beyond our technical expertise to decide on. But I don't see why there should be a problem using concrete here when it's successfully used elsewhere.
Well, I'll let Nick take over on that one, but what we've got to remember is there is a structural failure in the concrete, in these beams. It is there. It is undeniable. So something has gone wrong, either the original design or something else has gone wrong. But I'll let Nick answer on the other questions of what elsewhere happens elsewhere.
We've had a supplementary submission from Graham Nugent, who was one of the co-authors, who actually lives in Italy. He's got a funicular railway in his village. He knows quite a lot of them. I'm not sure where your information... We haven't got total data on number of steel versus concrete funiculars in railway. We'd had a look. It doesn't seem to be available. But anecdotally, most funiculars, right, appear to be steel, right, in the experience of people, not concrete. There are other differences about designs of funicular in Europe. I mean, I ski, ski Val d'Isère and Tignes and so on. Funiculars tend to be totally underground. They're not subject to the weather of Cairngorm. They go through tunnels. They're not subject to such extreme temperature variations because they're underground. They tend to be straight rather than curved, right? All these things. But there is a very good, in Graham's submission, there is a picture of one funicular which is actually lower down because they're used as a form of transport between villages rather than ski uplift. It is made of concrete, but interestingly, as he comments in that, the concrete beams in that case are twice the size of those used at Cairngorm. And so there's an issue, as Gordon said, about the size of the beams.
Could I just add, I was in Norway last week and I came back from Bergen, and there is a funicular there which I understand is the sort of model which encouraged HIE to build this Cairngorm funicular. Now the Bergen funicular is straight, there are no curves in it, which is a big issue on Cairngorm, and it starts from sea level. And I think there are major differences between what is happening on Cairngorm and other, particularly European funiculars, because most of them are at a lower level and very few of them go up into the extreme Arctic alpine environment which you get on Cairngorm. You've got to remember that we have in an oceanic climate, we have very, very cold and hostile weather at quite a low altitude, just above like 2,500 feet. So there are these big extremes which the Cairngorm funicular has to deal with.
Logical extension of what we've been talking about, HIE have suggested that the repairs could extend the funicular's life by up to 30 years. Again, what would the technical grounds be to say that claim is unrealistic?
Well, to begin with, they haven't had any clean bill of health for that structure. They've had 4 interim certificates of construction compliance. And this is since February of 2025. Now, remember, the funicular was first went into service in 2023 after the repairs. So there's been ongoing problems there to 2025. The engineers are saying, we can't sign this off as a long-term structure until certain works, certain checks. We don't know what they are because HIE will not release this through FOI, what actual work Balfour Beatty and Pic Everard want to see completed. And it'll be very interesting to see if they are willing to give it a longer bill of health after all of that work. But having seen all the work that's had to be done to keep that tensioning on all these struts and supports, that must require very significant extra maintenance. And I am quite sure that some of the beams themselves will need further support because further cracks will begin to appear. It is not gone away.
Mr. Beattie, if I can just say, and we should just say, none of us are engineers, right? We've got, Gordon's got more expertise. We're quite open about that. The people who we started to look at it all a bit, and the group associated partly because of the problems what were happening, and there are people who've got various aspects of expertise. But that was subsequently backed up. And we've got interested John Carson, who is one of Scotland's most eminent civil engineers, who did the Skye Bridge and so on. He's been quoted in the Press and Journal and saying that this just isn't going to work. Now, I'm not saying just because one eminent civil engineer says it doesn't mean to say it's right, but I think there are some serious engineering questions here. And I suppose for the purposes of what's been done has been done, but in terms of the implications of this, what we think, would hope the committee might look at is making some recommendations. If this continues, this ongoing repairs continues, right? What happens next time? What's expected of HIE, and what should they be doing meantime in the eventuality that these repairs fail? And because, as Gordon says, the evidence so far is the repairs aren't working.
On the line of similar line of questioning it, if the funicular were to fail, what would you see as the least cost and least risk outcome or option for the public sector at that point?
I actually believe if there is another significant failure incident happens, that from the public body point of view, they've got to seriously think about closing the funicular altogether. And this is why, and I think we alluded to maybe earlier on, and even in our discussions with Mike Gifford yesterday, Mike is quite keen to see extra uplift put in the way of a chairlift or something like that. He's said that. Now, he obviously needs funding for that. And I think it's important that the public purse is going to have to look at extra uplift so that if the funicular fails, then if the funicular disappears and has to be taken down, there is something else to keep going. You need something in parallel. And that's what should have happened back in 2020 if they had put in a chairlift at that time, even a partial chairlift, to give some extra uplift. Then even in this that day on Saturday, where there was queues and queues and queues, people could have gone up the chairlift and the funicular. But I think they need to have a belt and braces approach here. It will need more public money, unfortunately, because of the state we're in now.
Can I add that I don't think people appreciate the size of the public funding commitment which is coming down the road. Now, as regards annual revenue funding, Mike Gifford and his colleagues are probably going to do fairly well to get that down annually. But you have to understand that the funicular as it is today and working is not fit for purpose. Now, that is very evident from what the SE group recommended. They were the consultants, North American consultants, who were employed by HIE to look into future options on the mountain in 2016, 2017. And if I can just read what they said. Now, they said the funicular is a major asset for the resort. Now, those words are quoted by Islands and Islands Enterprise in their forward business plan. But they didn't complete the sentence, because the actual report from SE says it's a major asset, but the over-reliance on it is problematic, given its limited capacity and non-skier use. Its susceptibility to closure also hampers the experience of both skiing and non-skiing visitors, and solutions are needed. With improved uplift in place, Cairngorm should explore restricting the funicular to a few types of visitors, i.e. ski schools and non-skiers. Now, that is an absolutely damning conclusion. And so HIE were being told in 2017, 2018 that they had to put in basically new chairlifts. And in my discussions with Mike Gifford, my conclusion is that two chairlifts are needed from the bottom station now. They should have been built during the last sort of 10 years, and that capital expenditure is going to be well over £10 million, I would think, and that is what's coming down the road. And I think we to ideally get the resort back on its feet, I think it actually needs 4 new chairlifts to cover the mountain in the right way. We need to discuss where those might be with Mike Gifford and his colleagues and what the priority is. So I do think the committee must realise that there's some big expenditure coming down the road in terms of new capital expenditure.
We touched on the economic effects. Just a couple of quick questions on that. I'm conscious of time. Your submission says that doorstep research suggests that there's a limited impact on local businesses in terms of the funicular. How robust is that evidence, and how should it be compared to HIE's modelling?
If I could possibly say there, what would be very interesting to understand is what HIE's modelling is. If you look at the full business plan, the big turnaround from being totally negative for 30 years into being something way positive is the economic benefit of the funicular. But there's nowhere is there a paper that actually shows this massive input of money that comes from the funicular to the local community. So I would love to see that and be able to analyse that properly. The person who carried that survey out, it was Alan Bratty. He was involved with the community trust at the time. He rigorously, as well as he could, went round a whole load of people asking questions and got quite a rigorous answer. So I think in statistical terms he did very well. I can give an anecdote because, as well as all the other things I've done, my wife and I ran a bed and breakfast in Granton for 15 years. And we had thousands of people that went through our B&B. Almost nobody went up the funicular. There were so many other things to do in the area. In fact, the biggest problem everyone said is we should stay longer next time because there's so many things to do. For those who did go up the funicular, and because you're operating a bed and breakfast, you speak very closely with guests. You know, I asked them straightforwardly, did you enjoy it? Was it good? Yeah, it wasn't bad. Would you go up again? No, I won't go up again. That was the answers we got from, I know that's a very small handful of people, whoever it went up the funicular. There is so much else to do in the Cairngorms National Park. That's what needs to be remembered, and I would love to see how HIE have justified what's in the full business plan, because I do not see any justification for it at all.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do apologise. The clock is racing beyond us, and we are keen to ensure that all members have an opportunity to chat with you, but also to get as much out of you as we can to cross the wide area of subjects. I will require a little bit more brevity in responses. Not everyone needs to respond to every question, if that's okay. But I'd like Joe Fitzpatrick to put some questions to you.
Thanks, Convener. Unlike the other members of the committee, I didn't manage to join the visit. I had another committee, but I do know the hill. I'm not a skier, so it's the other activities in the area, and as Gordon Bullock said, there are lots of other things to do apart from they don't require to go into the very top with. I guess my question is around what are the alternatives and what future planning. So you've argued in your report that the 2021 master plan isn't actually a master plan in the planning sense. So it'd be good for the committee to hear what you think is missing from that. What should be there? What could make that a useful long-term planning document? Dave.
I think the future really depends on improving the attractiveness on the mountain, both for skiing, obviously, mountain biking, very important because it can be done in winter when there is no snow, and also the general visitor. And so I have been in discussions again with Mike Gifford, arguing the case for extensive footpath networks at a lower level, combining the forest and the hill zones, and though that network will get repeated use, and I live in Newton Moor, and I know that I would go up with my mountain bike or for a walk or a climb or whatever over and over again if the uplift was in the right places and the trails were developed in the right places. So I do think there is potentially a good future for Cairngorm. But all of these other things, these toboggan runs and things like that, this is like an Arctic Disneyland, and it will never make enough money, and they are a distraction. I'm very keen that this committee focuses on the key things which need to be done on Cairngorm to solve all of these problems, and make it quite clear that the hill should not be distracting itself and taking up lots of time pushing forward crazy projects which you won't need. And if you give the example of the coaster, well, it's too high on the mountain. I was in Sochi in Russia skiing a couple of years ago, about 3 or 3 years ago, and they have a coaster there, but it starts at the bottom of the lifts, goes down into the local community. These sort of facilities have to be built in the forest zone, not on the mountain zone, with the profit then going back onto the mountain zone.
Can I just supplement? You'll all know the weather at Cairngorm is not good. That's one of the fundamental problems with the funicular as a tourist attraction. It's not worth going up for most of the year, right, because of the cloud. It's exactly the same with all the diversification they're trying to do now. Actually, Cairngorm is a place, when I started to ski, just remember, I've never been so cold in my life as trying to learn to ski on Cairngorm. It is a tough place. They need to... If you focus on lift infrastructure, basically, they're focusing lots of things on beginner biking activities. It's the wrong place for beginner biking. If they're going to make money, they need to have lifts that are useful for skiers on the days there's snow, but that won't pay for itself, so they need to have lifts that also can be used for mountain biking, which is why we're suggesting lifts in the bottom half of the hill. We're not economic, experts, so the business case for that, if you like, but we believe that that is the way they're going to generate income to keep the business going, is just focusing on that, on new uplift that works, and everything else is more or less, it'd be great if the CAF was open longer than it is at the moment, right? But most of the other things are a distraction.
Just to be clear, the alternative to a funicular long term would be chairlifts, so not gondolas or something like that, chairlifts that you can get skis on and bikes and anything else.
Yeah, there are some issues, right, because of the sensitive nature of the Cairngorm Plateau, right? Mountain bikes you could not have mountain biking right up to where the funicular goes. So there's two separate issues. There's one really about taking mountain bikes to mid-mountain, which would be all right, and then that enables the skiers to connect with the remaining lift infrastructure, the remaining tows. So that is what we would see as a first phase. The longer term, what happened if the funicular failed totally? So what do you then do about the ptarmigan and things? I think that needs more discussion. But I mean, that's the money to deal with those things. I think we need to talk about the next 5 years first.
Longer term. So I guess you've kind of suggested that this hasn't just been one mistake at the start. There's been multiple mistakes in terms of lots of opportunities before money was respent. That's a different path could have been taken. But we are where we are, so we can't reverse the past. We can't unspend the money that's been spent. So if there's one thing, one recommendation that the committee could make, what would you be hoping that we come up with?
Get the HIE off the mountain. A lot of the problems will be solved if you manage to achieve that.
Okay, is that what everyone thinks? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we'll be
looking for one.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your brevity. I hope I didn't cut you short in any way. And I'm very willing to go over time if you've got more questions. No. Okay. Thank you. All right. I think on that note, I appreciate time is tight. There's only so much we can pack into a 1 hour session, but the committee was very much given your written submissions that were so comprehensive, we felt it would be better to get you in to give some oral evidence, and that evidence will now form part of the official report and our evidence gathering. So we are extremely grateful for your time and effort to come to us and give that evidence, and the committee will consider that evidence in due course in terms of our next steps. So we would very much like to thank Nick Kemp, Dave Morris and Gordon Bullock and your blog for its work and for being a meaningful part of our considerations this morning. So thank you very much. Thank you. Oh yes, of course. So on that note, as agreed earlier in the meeting, we will now move the committee session into private.